Okay, hi there, and welcome to a short revision video where we'll look at the substantial productivity gap between the UK and many of the UK's major competitor countries. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, 25 years ago, that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run it is almost everything. So productivity is the focus of this revision video. First of all, what do we mean by productivity? Productivity, essentially, is the measure of efficiency. It measures how much output of goods and services we're able to generate by using a given input. So our inputs of land and labour and capital, if we factor in the productivity of those inputs, we get a final output. And crucially, the more efficient an economy is, the more that can be supplied in a sustainable way. In other words, productivity growth is very important, extremely important for long-term growth of any economy, including that of the UK. This chart is for the UK. It takes us all the way back to 1830 and shows historical labour productivity in terms of GDP per hour worked on the right-hand scale, right-hand axis, and on the left-hand, also on the right-hand side, we see real GDP per person. So you can see that productivity is linked to an increase in output per person and also consumption per person, because real GDP, higher productivity, is able to generate increased wages for people in work. It also allows for more leisure time, because if we're more productive, we can get our work done a bit quicker, and that allows the average number of hours, if you like, not to be working per week gradually to fall. So what do we mean by the productivity gap? Well, this is a phrase used to describe a big and a sustained difference or gap in measured output per worker or output per person employed. And that's between one country and another. In other words, it's a relative measure of economic performance. So this chart shows comparative UK labour productivity. And it's shown as an index of GDP per hour worked for the year 2016. The UK's productivity is given as the base value for the index, hence the chart shows the UK at 100, and then we can compare and contrast other countries' productivities levels relative to the UK. We're actually more productive by this measure than Japan and Canada, but substantially less productive than the United States, France and Germany. Just using output per worker employed, the FT, the Financial Times, was saying that the productivity gap means that for every 5 days a British person is at work, a German worker only has to work 4 days to produce the same economic output. So the productivity gap is quite a substantial issue, and it's probably costing each family in the UK several £1,000s per year. This chart again shows an index of what's actually happened to productivity in the UK. And I'm sure you can see here that there's been quite a substantial levelling off or flattening of productivity growth, particularly since the 2007 global financial crisis. Indeed, labour productivity has essentially stagnated. The growth has fallen well below the pre-crisis trend. By some measures, productivity in the UK is no higher now in 2019 than it was before the 2008 financial crisis. And that's in stark contrast to the years before, if you look back from the mid-1990s on the chart. Indeed, had the pre-crisis trend continued beyond 2008, if there hadn't been a flattening of productivity, output per worker would probably be around 15 to 20% higher. And again, the long sweep of history can sometimes be a useful guide. This chart shows historical labour productivity in terms of GDP per hour worked, and it's the annual growth and a 10-year moving average source from the Bank of England. And again, you can see here that the deterioration, the deceleration in productivity growth has intensified in the last 10-15 years, although productivity growth has been slowing down, in fact, since the early 1970s. So finally, what is causing the productivity gap? Why is productivity in the UK less than that of other countries? There are many causes put forward by people. I'll pick out a few. Keep in mind I can't cover every single cause. One I think that most economists would agree on is that companies and businesses generally have invested too little. Investment in the UK is around 16 to 18% of GDP. Other countries it's substantially higher than that. Countries such as South Korea and obviously in China. So that means the low investment has an implication, one of which is that British firms tend to use slightly older machinery, older technology, because they've not invested enough. Some people argue that the last 10 years, the period of very low interest rates, has led to the survival of zombie companies, companies that are of the living dead, that are staggering on from one bailout or one refinancing to another, which in a normal recession would disappear, and they may be acting as a drag on productivity growth. Well, that's debatable. On the right-hand side, the third argument, low levels of research and development. Britain doesn't invest very much as a share of GDP in terms of research and development. So oftentimes companies are not quite at the cutting edge of new technologies. We know there are substantial, persistent and deep skill shortages in many key industries. A lot of businesses complaining that they can't get hold of the really highly skilled workers they want. And clearly if there are big skills gaps, that can act as a barrier to productivity growth. So too could be relatively low levels of competition. Perhaps in the UK there are too many industries where there is a lot of market power, monopoly or oligopoly power, and perhaps if industries and markets were a little bit more contestable and a bit more dynamic, that would get rid of some of the inefficiencies and lift average productivity. And perhaps some of the cause of the productivity gap lies in sociological explanations. Perhaps a decade or more of fairly low, often negative real wage growth has sapped the morale and the self-esteem and confidence of workers. Perhaps the low wage economy in many jobs is also acting as a barrier to productivity growth. Keep in mind that the fast expansion of the digital economy may mean that we're not necessarily finding it easy to measure the value of output per worker, in part because so many consumer services like Google and Facebook, etc., are available on the web for free, so finding the value of that output is not always easy. But we know there is a big productivity gap between the UK and other countries. It is one of the key supply side weaknesses, and one that governments across the years have tried to address. It's going to require a range of demand and supply side policies. So in the next video, we'll look at policies designed to improve productivity to try to close the productivity gap.